Burkes Pentad is a tool from the world of rhetoric, and it allows us to make sense of motivation in a dramatic situation. So we have these 5 terms here: act, agent, scene, purpose, and agency, and you can put them around a star in any order you like. And these terms allow us to kind of describe a sentence, a situation, a picture, a painting, and make sense of what is happening and what is motivating what. Right? So it's a very useful tool. It doesn't seem immediately relevant to rhetoric in the sense that we're not trying to persuade somebody. But of course it does help us ultimately in persuading, because if we can understand motivation, then we can definitely use our speech effectively to make a point or a case to somebody else. And you can just think of something like a legal case where you have to account for motivation to persuade other people. So this then is called a heuristic. And a heuristic is a tool that we use to help our thought process. We're trying to get somewhere, but eventually we can leave the tool behind and we can just deal with the results. So it's a little bit like a ladder. You know, you use a ladder to construct a building, and once it's done, you don't need to see it anymore. Now, as you look at this diagram, you'll notice that Burkes Pentad is quite similar to the journalistic questions. So for instance, if we ask what is happening, then we would say that's the act. If we say who is doing the action, then we get the agent. If we say how does it happen, then we get agency, and we're talking about tools and means. The scene answers 2 questions. It answers the questions when and where. So what's the surrounding scene where something takes place? And then the purpose answers the question why. Okay? But as we'll see, the Pentad is in some ways more interesting than the journalistic questions, because it's not so much about one term in isolation, but it's much more about the relationship between terms and the tension and the ambiguity in terms of accounting for motivation. So now that we have our terms, we can apply them, and we can do that with this sentence. And I wanted to start with a sentence because Burke's book in which he talked about these ideas is called A Grammar of Motives. That's important because this is a bit like grammar, where we can take sentences apart, just like with parts of speech, but this time we're accounting for motivation. So what we have here is an agent, the mayor. We have an action, cutting a ribbon. We have a scene, this afternoon, that's when, and a cemetery, that's where. We also have a purpose, to open the cemetery. And we have some tools, some means. They're not necessarily spelled out, but we can imagine the mayor has a scissor. There's a ribbon, right? This ceremony has some means and tools. Now, we could stop there, but of course, the main thing with this is to account for what is doing what, right? What causes something to happen. So if we start with the cutting of the ribbon as the central act and we focus on that, then we could say, well, who is doing that? The mayor's doing that. So we could account for this as the agent. Okay, the agent is influencing the act. So we call this a ratio, a relationship between terms where one influences another one is dominant, and the other one is sort of relative to that. If we read the scene differently, we might come up with different explanations. We could give a lot of credit, for instance, to the scene, the society, which really values ribbon cutting. And so it's not the mayor who's really responsible for this. It's the organizing committee. It's all of the people sort of around this. It's social pressures that require this kind of cutting of the ribbon. So this sentence seems very, very simple in the fact that the agent seems to do it, but we could definitely construct different sentences to account for motivation. Next, we'll have a look here at a picture, and again, we can make sense of this through our 5 terms. So we have this picture Tank Man, which describes this protester in Tiananmen Square in 1989, standing in front of a lineup of tanks. There are at least a couple of ways of focusing on this picture. So we could say, well, it's the protester that we're interested in. Or we could say, well, no, it's this lineup of cars here, tanks here, and that's what we're interested in. So if we account for motivation from the perspective of the protester, we could say that the act is something like taking a stand. We take a stand. Okay? But if we account for the act from the opposite point of view, from the point of view of the government, then we can say, well, the government is trying to suppress protest. A lot then depends on how we read the motivation, and both of these answers can obviously be true at the same time. We could go through this. We could talk about the agents. We have a protester, we have the government, we have tank commanders. We could talk about the scene. This is Tiananmen Square. But more broadly, it's also the whole democratic movement at the time, the one-party political system in China. It's Beijing. It's so many other things that form kind of part of the scene or the context for this particular event. We could talk about purpose. The government wants to establish control. The protester wants to fight for freedom. He's maybe interested in sacrifice or martyrdom. And we can talk about agency. This man only has his body, whereas these tanks, obviously, those are means or tools of the government to create control. So you can see that the Pentad really helps us to kind of make sense then of a picture and account for motivation. And then again, we have to make a decision about what is the central thing we think that accounts for this. What is really the dominant motivation here? We can take this one step further by actually starting with a topic, as we have here. Put it in the middle of your star. Put one term on top of it that you think really defines this topic, that the first term you sort of associate with this topic, and then create a number of these ratios to account for motivation. And this will really help you if you're writing an essay, let's say. In this case, what we've done is we've picked the topic ending police brutality. There should be a colon here. So our topic is ending police brutality. That's what our goal is. And as you can see, that really has to do with purpose. That's the purpose, what we're looking for, right? It's an idea as opposed to an action. If we had chopped off ending, and we just talked about police brutality, then we might be closer to something like an act. So if this is our topic, then what we do is we relate this term purpose that we have sort of singled out to the other terms, and we create these ratios. If you look at our sample sentences here, we have just given a couple of examples. The first one goes, with better trained police officers, we can end police brutality. So there's our purpose, right? And then over here, talking about trained police officers, this has to do with the agent, the people. And the ratio then is really agent-purpose. Okay, so this is one possible ratio that allows us to explain motivation and action and so on. The second one goes, police brutality will end only when we eradicate poverty. So eradicating poverty is more of a systemic issue, and this has to do with scene. So in this case, what we're talking about is a scene-purpose ratio. And you can go on through all of them and try to account for the different ways in which this topic can be described. And what that shows, and we'll end with this thought, is actually a particular worldview. Because as Kenneth Burke points out, each of us tends to approach or explain the world from a slightly different angle, and we account for motivation in different ways. So the worldviews that align with this are that an act is typically described as a form of realism. Okay? We say that acts sort of determine events and account for events. If you talk about the agent all the time, then your worldview is idealism. So people cause events. If you use scene, then you're using materialism. Materialism, the context, the surrounding, the society, this causes events. Agency is what's called pragmatism. Okay, pragmatism. And lastly, purpose is mysticism. It's ideas that cause things to happen. And you can see that these 5 worldviews really align with particular ways of thinking. So for instance, purpose, mysticism, this has to do with a worldview like Hegel's, who talks about ideas influencing history. Materialism is much closer to Marx, let's say, who talks about the base of society, the economic conditions influencing things that happen in that society. Now this is a bit more abstract and advanced, but hopefully the basic idea helps you that the pentad can get at motivation and that it's most useful when we talk about the relationship or the ratios between these terms.